Don't make a sound. Get up and come with me. And that second time that I heard this voice, I was instantly away.
She was only 14, taken from her own bed while her little sister watched, too terrified to scream. For 9 months, Elizabeth Smart was hidden in plain sight, controlled by a man who believed he was a prophet of God. So why didn't she run even when help was right in front of her? The answer reveals one of the most disturbing cases of psychological control ever recorded. Stay until the end to understand how it happened, and if you're drawn to the psychology behind the darkest true crime, subscribe. In the stillness of a June night in 2002, Salt Lake City slept. The world of 14-year-old Elizabeth Smart was safe, familiar, anchored by the rhythms of faith, family, and the quiet security of her own bed. Until a voice, sharp as a blade, split that silence. "Get up, don't make a sound, come with me or I'll kill you." It was the moment Elizabeth Smart's reality fractured. The moment a child's sense of safety was replaced by the primal language of terror. That command wasn't just a threat, it was an initiation. A carefully engineered psychological event, what experts in coercion call a trauma induction. When Brian David Mitchell broke into the Smart home that night, his weapon wasn't only the knife he held to Elizabeth's throat. His real weapon was fear. By threatening to kill her and her family, he implanted the first seed of control, a terror so absolute that it short-circuited logic. For a child raised in trust and morality, the idea that defiance could mean the death of loved ones was unbearable. In the mind of a victim, this kind of terror doesn't dissipate, it etches itself in. Psychologists call this the foundational trauma, the moment the victim's survival instinct fuses with obedience. Elizabeth wasn't simply taken, she was programmed, conditioned in that instant to equate silence with safety, compliance with survival. This is how psychological imprisonment begins, not with chains, but with belief. The belief that resistance equals death. Fight, flight, freeze. In that dark bedroom, Elizabeth's body chose the third. The freeze response isn't weakness, it's evolution's oldest defense. When the brain's fear circuitry, the amygdala, detects mortal danger, it floods the body with stress hormones. Rational thought shuts down. Movement becomes impossible. The goal is no longer escape, it's invisibility. That night, Elizabeth's mind entered that frozen state. Her ability to plan or think was suspended. What remained was a singular, consuming directive. Do whatever it takes to stay alive. From that moment, Mitchell's control wasn't physical, it was neurological. He had hijacked the most primitive part of her survival brain. And that's the terrifying truth of psychological captivity. When fear is used strategically, it doesn't just control behavior, it rewires the victim's entire perception of safety and danger. As Mitchell led Elizabeth through the mountains, the knife pressed against her back, her mind began its descent into a new psychological reality. Every step away from home deepened her sense of helplessness. Every minute that passed reinforced the illusion that rescue was impossible. He told her that if she tried to run, he would kill her. He told her that no one would find her. He told her that God had chosen her, and that this was her destiny. Each of these statements served a specific function: to strip away agency and replace it with dependency. Psychologists call this learned helplessness, a state discovered through experiments showing that when subjects are repeatedly exposed to inescapable pain or threat, they eventually stop trying to escape, even when escape becomes possible. In Elizabeth's case, that conditioning began immediately. Mitchell didn't need to tie her up to make her stay. He tied her mind to him instead. From the outside, we often ask, why didn't she run? Why didn't she scream? But in that moment, Elizabeth's choices had already been rewritten. To a mind freshly traumatized, obedience feels like the only path to survival. Every second of that first night built upon the same message, your life, your family's lives, depend on me. That's the myth of choice in captivity. The victim isn't choosing to stay. The victim has been psychologically cornered into believing that staying is the only way to keep everyone safe. This illusion becomes the captor's greatest power and the victim's invisible cage. Mitchell understood, consciously or not, the psychology of control. He began his process like a cult leader, through isolation, fear, and repetition. First, he isolated her physically, taking her into the wilderness where her screams would echo into nothing. Then he isolated her psychologically, convincing her that no one would save her, that no one even could. In that isolation, his voice became the only one she heard. His rules became the only structure she could rely on, and his approval became the only thing that stood between her and annihilation. Every captor who uses coercive control follows the same invisible script. They destroy the victim's existing reality, then rebuild a new one, brick by brick, with themselves at the center. Mitchell didn't just kidnap Elizabeth Smart. He began constructing her new universe, one where he was God's chosen prophet and she was his divine bride. But to make that fantasy believable, he had to first ensure that she no longer trusted her own mind. The threat, "I'll kill you and your family," wasn't a one-time statement. It was a psychological system. By repeating the threat in different ways over the coming days and weeks, Mitchell conditioned Elizabeth to feel his power even when he wasn't speaking. The fear became self-sustaining. She didn't need to see the knife anymore. Her mind carried the image for him. This is known in forensic psychology as internalized threat maintenance, when the victim continues to police their own behavior to avoid punishment, even in the captor's absence. It's one of the most effective and insidious forms of psychological imprisonment. Over time, the victim's thoughts become aligned with the captor's demands, not through belief, but through repetition and dread. Paradoxically, this environment of terror can also give rise to what psychologists call traumatic bonding, sometimes referred to as Stockholm Syndrome. When a victim's only source of comfort, food, or hope is also their source of terror, the brain fuses those feelings together. The captor becomes both monster and savior, the person who can hurt you, but also the only one who can spare you. That's how control evolves from fear into emotional dependency. And once dependency takes root, the need for physical restraint disappears. Elizabeth's captors didn't need to chain her every night. They had already chained her mind. By the time dawn broke on that first night, something irreversible had begun. Elizabeth Smart, the bright, confident girl from Salt Lake City, had been replaced by a new psychological identity, one built on terror, silence, and survival. The foundation of fear had been laid, and it would become the architecture upon which every later act of control was built. Mitchell didn't need to raise his knife again to keep her obedient. He only had to remind her, through tone, through threat, through twisted prophecy, that he held the power of life and death. And that belief, that fear, would become the foundation of her captivity. Fear was the seed, but faith was the soil where control took root. Once Elizabeth Smart's captors had established terror as the foundation, Brian David Mitchell began cultivating something even more powerful: belief. Not belief in rescue or goodness or God as Elizabeth had always known him, but belief in him. To understand how Elizabeth Smart was controlled so completely, we have to see how Mitchell weaponized her most sacred convictions, turning her own faith against her. This was no longer just captivity, it was indoctrination. In the barren hills above Salt Lake City, Mitchell began to recast himself not as a criminal, but as a divine figure. He called himself Emmanuel David Isaiah, the messenger of God. His partner Wanda Barzee played the role of his disciple and enforcer. For Elizabeth, raised in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, faith was the cornerstone of her identity. She believed in prophets, revelation, and divine callings. Mitchell exploited that framework, inserting himself into it. He didn't demand loyalty through violence alone. He demanded faith. And to a 14-year-old whose entire moral compass revolved around obedience to God, the line between submission to Mitchell and submission to God began to blur. Every cult, every manipulative system of control begins with a story. Mitchell's story was grand and grotesque. He told Elizabeth that she was not kidnapped, she was chosen. Chosen to be his wife, his spiritual companion, the mother of nations. Chosen by God for a divine purpose that only he could reveal. For a terrified teenager, that story did something critical. It transformed meaningless suffering into sacred suffering. This is what psychologists call cognitive reframing under duress, when the mind, overwhelmed by trauma, accepts a new narrative to make sense of unbearable pain. If she was chosen, then she wasn't just a victim. She had a reason to endure. Mitchell's manipulation was elegant in its cruelty. He replaced terror with purpose and submission with sanctity. In this new framework, Elizabeth wasn't enslaved. She was anointed. To break a person's will, you don't have to take away their beliefs. You just have to corrupt them. Mitchell spoke in Scripture. He quoted the Bible, twisting verses into justifications for his commands. He declared himself the Davidic king and claimed Elizabeth's obedience was an act of worship. When she resisted, he said she was resisting God. When she cried, he said her tears were signs of spiritual weakness. When she questioned, he framed her doubt as sin. This is known as spiritual coercion, when a perpetrator uses religious authority to override moral autonomy. For Elizabeth, this meant that every instinct toward escape, every spark of defiance, became tangled in guilt and fear. If she disobeyed Mitchell, she wasn't just risking punishment, she was risking damnation. Mitchell created a world with only two moral poles: obedience and destruction. He told her that the world was wicked, that God had chosen them to survive an impending apocalypse. He warned her that her family would perish unless she fulfilled her divine role. And he taught her that salvation, for her and those she loved, depended on her purity, her loyalty, and her submission. This system of thought is what cult psychologists call dualistic conditioning, the belief that only through the leader's approval can one be saved, and that any form of resistance equals catastrophe. Under this system, Elizabeth's mind became a battlefield between her love for her family and her fear of their destruction. To disobey Mitchell wasn't just rebellion, it was betrayal. In that moral inversion, control became total. Mitchell's manipulation didn't exist in isolation. It followed a well-documented pattern seen in destructive cults throughout history. Charles Manson, David Koresh, Jim Jones all used the same triad of psychological tools. Isolation, cut off the victim from outside reality. Divine authority, declare the self as God's chosen voice. Moral inversion, redefine evil as good and obedience as holy. Mitchell followed this blueprint with chilling precision. Like Manson, he wrapped violence in scripture. Like Koresh, he declared sexual servitude a divine duty. Like Jones, he cultivated dependency through apocalyptic fear. The difference was scale. Mitchell didn't need a commune, he only needed one believer. And in Elizabeth, he found a child whose moral world could be rewritten from the inside out. Every day in captivity became a ritual of indoctrination. Mitchell would pray aloud, perform ceremonies, and deliver long, rambling revelations. He controlled every act, when she spoke, when she ate, when she prayed. Even her thoughts, he said, must be pure, devoted entirely to him. This level of control aligns with what psychologists call thought reform, a process by which a victim's cognitive boundaries are systematically eroded through repetition, deprivation, and manipulation of meaning. Elizabeth was not free to think independently because every thought was filtered through the lens Mitchell imposed. God's will equals his will. And over time, that equation began to feel true. Faith had always been Elizabeth's compass, but under Mitchell's control, that compass spun wildly. He told her that if she tried to escape, God would blind those searching for her. He told her that her prayers for rescue would go unanswered because God wanted her to stay. And he told her that her family believed she was dead, that they had already moved on. Each lie chipped away at her trust in her own perception. When reality becomes fluid, when truth and falsehood merge under the authority of a single voice, the mind begins to surrender. This is the essence of cognitive dissonance collapse, when a victim, unable to reconcile two conflicting truths, accepts the one that ensures survival. Elizabeth's survival depended on believing him. Even if a small part of her doubted, that doubt was drowned out by fear, not of death this time, but of divine punishment.
What makes Mitchell's manipulation uniquely effective is that it didn't rely solely on fear. It relied on spiritual intimacy. He positioned himself not only as God's prophet, but as the bridge between Elizabeth and salvation. By merging religious devotion with emotional dependency, he created what forensic psychologists call fusion coercion, a state in which the victim's emotional, moral, and spiritual survival all depend on the captor. Mitchell didn't need to threaten her daily. By then, she needed his approval. His validation became her fragile tether to meaning. And when meaning itself depends on the abuser, escape feels like spiritual suicide. Mitchell and Barzee reinforced their control by maintaining constant isolation. Elizabeth was cut off from the world. No mirrors, no clocks, no human contact except them. They told her that no one was looking for her, that even if she were found, people would call her a sinner, a harlot, a fallen girl. This tactic is known as stigmatized dependency, convincing the victim that society would reject them, leaving the captor as their only refuge. The more she believed this, the tighter the psychological cage became. To a child raised to seek approval, forgiveness, and belonging, this sense of spiritual exile was devastating. Mitchell exploited that ache, presenting himself as the only one who could restore her worth, but only through continued obedience. Mitchell understood what every manipulator knows: repetition rewires belief. Day after day, he recited the same phrases: that she was chosen, that this was her divine purpose, that disobedience meant death. Neuroscience shows that under prolonged trauma and repetition, the brain begins to accept these messages as truth. The neural pathways that once processed doubt weaken. Those that process compliance strengthen. By repeating the same distorted theology, Mitchell didn't just teach Elizabeth what to believe, he trained her how to think. And in that environment, even falsehoods became sacred law. There's a moment in every captivity where the mind divides itself to survive. Elizabeth learned to create mental distance, a dissociative state where she could endure pain without fully experiencing it. This is a natural response to prolonged trauma, known as identity fragmentation. The self begins to split. One part survives, obeys, endures. The other retreats, protecting whatever remnants of identity remain untouched. In Mitchell's world, where faith had been turned into a weapon, this split deepened. Outwardly, she became the obedient wife he demanded. Inwardly, a small, silent part of her clung to the truth that this was not divine, not holy, not right. But that inner voice was faint, buried beneath months of indoctrination. And for now, survival meant silence. Mitchell's theology was not random madness, it was instrumental. By claiming that every command came from God, he removed himself as the agent of harm. He was no longer the abuser, he was the messenger. This psychological shift allowed him to inflict suffering without guilt, and it forced Elizabeth to see her suffering as divinely ordained. This is the dark genius of coercive faith manipulation. It transforms the victim into a willing participant in their own captivity. And so Elizabeth prayed, not for freedom, but for strength to fulfill what she believed was God's will. That is the depth of control, when the victim polices themselves on the captor's behalf. Mitchell's greatest success was not in keeping Elizabeth hidden, it was in keeping her silent. He conditioned her to see silence as sacred obedience. He told her that speaking to anyone, revealing her true identity, would unleash divine wrath upon her family. And when you believe your words could kill the people you love most, silence becomes an act of love. That is the ultimate paradox of psychological captivity. The victim's silence is not submission, it's protection. To Elizabeth, her compliance was not weakness, it was sacrifice. By the end of this phase, Mitchell no longer needed to enforce obedience through overt threat. His theology had done the work for him. Elizabeth's faith, once her shield, had been turned into her chain. She believed escape meant sin. She believed defiance meant destruction. And she believed survival meant obedience. Mitchell had achieved what every cult leader dreams: a follower who polices herself, a victim who believes captivity is sacred duty. And through that belief, he erased the distinction between God and captor. The weaponization of faith was complete. The same faith that had once taught Elizabeth that light conquers darkness was now being used to convince her that darkness was divine. And with her sense of morality inverted and her spiritual compass corrupted, Mitchell had forged something far stronger than physical chains. He had created a psychological covenant, a bond sanctified in fear, sealed in Scripture, and enforced by the belief that God Himself demanded her silence.
Fear had silenced her. Faith had bound her. Now came the final step in Elizabeth Smart's psychological imprisonment, the dismantling of identity itself. For Brian David Mitchell, control wasn't complete until Elizabeth ceased to exist as Elizabeth Smart. He didn't just want her obedience, he wanted to erase the very person capable of resistance. To destroy a mind, you don't need to destroy the body. You only need to convince the victim that the person they once were, their name, their voice, their past, is gone forever. It began with a single act of symbolic violence, the renaming. Mitchell declared that Elizabeth was no longer Elizabeth. She was Augustine, a new name for a new existence. This wasn't random, it was psychological surgery. By renaming her, Mitchell wasn't just giving her a title, he was taking ownership of her identity. Names are anchors to the self. They connect us to our history, our family, our sense of continuity. Strip that away, and the person becomes unmoored, floating in whatever new narrative the captor creates. Psychologists call this identity dissolution, a deliberate tactic to destabilize the victim's self-concept. In cults, it's common practice. Followers are renamed to sever ties with their past. The old self dies, the new self belongs to the leader. In that same ritual, Elizabeth Smart, the girl who once laughed at the piano, who dreamed of college, who believed in the warmth of family dinners, was buried beneath the desert dust. And in her place stood Augustine, a name chosen by her captor, sanctified by fear. Mitchell enforced the transformation through clothing. He dressed Elizabeth in long, concealing robes and a veil, covering her from head to toe. He claimed it was for modesty, for holiness, but in truth, it was another layer of control. When the world can't see you, you begin to disappear. When you can't see yourself, your face, your expression, your reflection, you begin to forget who you are. This was not modesty, it was coercive degradation. Degradation isn't only about humiliation, it's about depersonalization. It strips away the markers of individuality until the victim's body no longer feels like their own. Every time Elizabeth adjusted that veil, she was reminded that she belonged to someone else's world. Every layer of fabric was another barrier between her and her past self. To Mitchell, this disguise was spiritual. To Elizabeth, it became psychological armor, protection and prison at once. For months, Elizabeth lived in isolation, hidden in a makeshift camp in the Utah mountains. No calendar, no mirror, no contact with anyone beyond Mitchell and Barzee. Time dissolved, day bled into night, memory blurred. Without external reference points, the brain begins to lose its orientation. Psychologists call this temporal disintegration, when a person's sense of time and continuity collapses under prolonged isolation. Without clocks, days lose meaning. Without mirrors, faces fade from memory. Without conversation, language itself begins to erode. Mitchell ensured that Elizabeth's only remaining source of feedback, her only mirror, was him. Every human instinct to belong, to be seen, to be acknowledged, was now filtered through the man who had destroyed her. That is how captivity evolves into dependence. When the only voice that confirms your existence is your captor's, you begin to depend on that voice even when it lies. Mitchell reinforced her erasure through a perverse theology of invisibility. He told her that God wanted her hidden, that she must remain unseen until the time of revelation. He said that if she were ever discovered, divine wrath would follow. This spiritualized invisibility served two functions. It protected him from capture and deepened her psychological submission. By making invisibility sacred, he made silence holy. By turning concealment into divine duty, he transformed fear into obedience. Over time, Elizabeth didn't just obey the rule of hiding, she believed in it. That's the genius of coercive indoctrination. It forces the victim to internalize the very mechanisms of their captivity. She was no longer being hidden by her captor. She was hiding for him. In interviews years later, Elizabeth described how she stopped thinking of herself as Elizabeth. That wasn't forgetfulness, it was survival. When trauma becomes unbearable, the mind erects walls to keep identity fragments safe. Psychologists describe this as protective dissociation, a mental compartmentalization that allows a person to function while psychologically escaping from pain. For Elizabeth, detaching from her old identity may have been the only way to endure. To remember who she was, a daughter, a sister, a beloved child, would have meant confronting the full horror of her reality. So the mind did what the body could not. It hid. Elizabeth was placed behind a locked door in her consciousness. Augustine was the one who lived day to day, compliant, numb, obedient. This is how trauma survivors protect themselves, not by fighting, but by splitting. And in captivity, that split becomes the thin line between madness and survival. Mitchell's control extended beyond camp walls. When they left the mountains, he moved Elizabeth through cities and towns, sometimes in plain sight. To the outside world, they were wanderers. To Elizabeth, they were ghosts. Every relocation reinforced her belief that escape was impossible. Every near encounter with normalcy, the sound of passing cars, laughter, music, only deepened her alienation. Mitchell's constant movement wasn't just about avoiding police, it was about maintaining disorientation. This is a classic element of coercive control. Keep the victim uncertain, exhausted, and unable to predict what comes next. Without stability, there's no mental ground to stand on. And without ground, you can't plan, hope, or rebel. By the time they reached San Diego, Elizabeth had been living in a suspended state, untethered from time, self, and identity.
Mitchell alternated between cruelty and comfort. He starved her, then fed her. He berated her, then called her his angel. This unpredictable cycle created what psychologists term intermittent reinforcement, a behavioral pattern that makes the victim's attachment to the abuser even stronger. When kindness follows cruelty, it feels like mercy. When a moment of calm follows terror, it feels like love. Over time, the brain becomes addicted to the relief that follows suffering, and the person responsible for that relief becomes the center of the victim's emotional world. Mitchell's manipulation turned dependence into devotion. To Elizabeth, every tiny gesture of leniency felt like proof that he was divinely guided, that her suffering had meaning. That's how you break a person without laying a hand on them. You make them believe that their pain has a holy purpose. There's a stage in prolonged coercion where external control becomes internalized, when the victim begins to self-police, enforcing the captor's rules even in their absence. By the time Elizabeth had been held for several months, Mitchell no longer needed to threaten her constantly. She avoided eye contact with strangers. She obeyed every ritual. She referred to herself by her new name. This is psychological captivity in its purest form, when freedom no longer feels like safety and obedience feels like survival. To an outsider, it might look like passivity, but inside, it's a war, a constant, exhausting effort to stay alive by staying invisible. Mitchell's erasure of Elizabeth's identity wasn't just a means of control. It was a weapon against empathy. If she no longer saw herself as Elizabeth Smart, the missing girl everyone loved, then the world couldn't save her. Because to be saved, you must first believe you deserve saving. That belief had been taken from her. He replaced it with shame, guilt, and the false conviction that she was now unworthy of rescue. This is what coercive degradation achieves. It makes the victim complicit in their own silence. Elizabeth didn't speak up, not because she didn't want to, but because she believed that the girl she used to be no longer existed to speak. From a forensic psychology perspective, Elizabeth's captivity represents a near-complete model of identity deconstruction. Mitchell employed a combination of techniques used by cults, interrogators, and traffickers: isolation, severing all external support systems; identity replacement, renaming, recostuming, recontextualizing; cognitive control, rewriting moral and spiritual frameworks; emotional dependency, alternating punishment and affection; self-regulation, inducing compliance through internalized fear. These elements don't just suppress resistance, they annihilate the self. And that was the goal. Because a person without an identity cannot rebel. A person without a name cannot cry out to be found. Perhaps the most haunting evidence of this erasure came months later, when Elizabeth stood in public, veiled, quiet, compliant, beside her captors. Police officers approached. They asked questions, and Elizabeth said nothing. It wasn't stupidity, it wasn't choice. It was the culmination of everything Mitchell had built, a psychological system so complete that even in freedom's presence, she remained captive. To understand that silence, we must see it not as a decision, but as a conditioned reflex. When your identity has been erased, your voice is no longer your own. And so she stayed silent, because Augustine could not speak, and Elizabeth Smart, for that moment in time, no longer existed. In the cold machinery of coercion, fear builds the walls, faith locks the doors, and identity erasure removes the key. Elizabeth wasn't invisible because she wanted to be. She was invisible because she had been made to be. And before she could ever be found by the world, she would first have to be found by herself.
For 9 months, Elizabeth Smart's existence had been reduced to performance, an endless play in which she was forced to portray the role of Augustine, the obedient spiritual wife of a self-proclaimed prophet. Every breath, every word, every step she took was dictated by Brian David Mitchell and monitored by Wanda Barzay. What looked from the outside like free movement, walking through town, visiting public spaces, was, for Elizabeth, just another stage where survival required submission. To understand the psychology of this, we must look beyond the question of why she didn't run. The real question is, why would she believe she couldn't? By the time Elizabeth was seen in public, her mind had been rewired through months of coercive control. This wasn't obedience in the way we understand it. This was survival through compliance. When Mitchell led her into town, her body walked beside him, but her identity, her agency, had been buried beneath layers of fear and indoctrination. Mitchell had constructed a closed system of belief around her, one where he was the voice of God and disobedience meant annihilation. He had repeatedly told her that if she disobeyed, he would slaughter her family, burn her home, and make her watch. He claimed to have divine powers, that God himself revealed her family's fate to him. In a child's mind already traumatized and isolated, this wasn't a metaphor, it was truth. When your entire world shrinks to one abuser, reality itself becomes what they say it is. Mitchell didn't just use fear of violence, he used religious terror. He fused her faith with his dominance. In his warped theology, Elizabeth's suffering was holy, her silence was sacred, and any resistance would not just betray him, but betray God. This is known as trauma-based compliance conditioning. It's the gradual process of turning fear into reflex, until disobedience isn't even a conscious option. Every time Mitchell threatened her and followed through by hitting, starving, or isolating her, the connection between rebellion and punishment became hardwired. The brain learns resisting equals pain, obedience equals survival. Psychologists call this learned helplessness, a condition first identified in animal experiments where subjects, after repeated punishment, stopped trying to escape even when escape was possible. By the time Elizabeth had been held for months, she had internalized a fundamental rule: I cannot win, I can only obey. So when they walked into town, veil over her face, chain still hidden beneath her robe, she wasn't a free girl among strangers. She was a prisoner walking inside an invisible cage, trained to perform her captivity as if it were belief. The day of the infamous encounter, March 12, 2003, was deceptively ordinary. Mitchell and Barzeh had taken Elizabeth to a public library in Sandy, Utah. They were living out of sight, surviving on delusion and divine theatrics. By then, their appearance had drawn attention. Mitchell's long beard, his white robe, and Elizabeth's veiled face made people uneasy. 2 local residents had recognized her, even calling police to investigate. And so, 2 officers approached them. Imagine this moment from Elizabeth's perspective. A uniformed officer, a symbol of safety, justice, and freedom, is standing before her. Her name, her face, her story have been broadcast across America for months. She knows the world is looking for her. Deep down, she knows the officer could save her. But standing next to her is Mitchell, the man who told her he was God's chosen prophet, the man who said he could read her thoughts, the man who claimed he could kill her family without even touching them. Mitchell had conditioned her to believe his presence was omnipotent. His eyes on her felt like a spiritual surveillance system. Even thinking about revealing her identity felt dangerous, like committing a cosmic sin. When the officer asked questions, Mitchell spoke first. Calm, confident, rehearsed. He said she was his daughter, that they were a traveling family bound by faith. The lies slid off his tongue like scripture. And Elizabeth stayed silent. To the world it looked like fear, but to Elizabeth, silence was safety. Silence was obedience. Silence was survival. In that moment, the psychological prison was complete. The performance of compliance was so ingrained that to break character, even for rescue, felt impossible. She feared that if she told the truth, 2 things would happen instantly.
Mitchell would kill her family, and she would be responsible for it. In her mind, the police couldn't protect her from divine wrath. Mitchell wasn't just a man, he was the voice of apocalypse. So she denied herself. When the officer asked, "Are you Elizabeth Smart?" she looked down, her voice muffled by the veil, and said, "No." The lie was a reflex, one she had been forced to master.
This is what coercive control looks like in its purest form, a victim protecting their abuser not out of love, but out of terror and indoctrination. Mitchell's genius, his monstrosity, lay in transforming Elizabeth's survival instinct into a weapon against her own freedom. For her, captivity had become the only safe structure left. Freedom was unfamiliar. It meant unpredictable consequences, possible death, and divine punishment. Captivity, for all its horror, had rules she understood. That's the paradox of psychological imprisonment. The cage becomes more predictable than the outside world. So she complied. She lowered her gaze. She let Mitchell do the talking. And when the officers finally walked away, she felt relief, not because she was safe, but because she had survived another test of obedience. Later, as she reflected on that moment, Elizabeth would describe the suffocating fear that ruled her mind, a fear that told her, "If I do anything wrong, everyone I love will die." This wasn't irrational in her context. It was logical given the months of manipulation that preceded it. When you've been told every day that your captor's will equals God's, the idea of defiance feels like blasphemy. Even when the world sees a clear exit, the captive sees only fire on the other side. Mitchell's control wasn't physical anymore, it was existential. He had rewritten her reality. It would take the persistence of multiple witnesses, law enforcement cooperation, and a final moment of hesitation from Mitchell himself before Elizabeth's silence broke. When confronted again, when officers separated her and pressed further, she finally whispered the truth. "I am Elizabeth Smart." The words shattered 9 months of indoctrination. But even in that moment, her voice wasn't triumphant. It was trembling, fragile. Because breaking a psychological spell doesn't happen in an instant. It begins with doubt, grows with courage, and only becomes real when someone else confirms your reality. That's what those officers did. They didn't just identify her, they reminded her she existed. For the first time in months, Elizabeth Smart became real again. That street encounter, so often framed as a missed rescue, wasn't a failure of courage. It was a testament to how total coercive control can be. It showed the world how a child's will can be hijacked, reshaped, and held hostage long after the physical chains are gone. Elizabeth Smart didn't stay silent because she wanted to. She stayed silent because her entire mind had been turned against her. Mitchell didn't just imprison her body, he imprisoned her beliefs. And that, more than anything, is what made her captivity so powerful and her eventual recovery so extraordinary. Freedom would not come the moment she was found. The real battle would begin after. Because once the cage door opened, Elizabeth had to learn how to step through it, and more importantly, how to rebuild the self that had been dismantled piece by piece.
When the police finally led Elizabeth Smart away from Brian David Mitchell that March afternoon in 2003, the world celebrated her rescue. Cameras flashed, reporters called it a miracle. But for Elizabeth herself, liberation was not a single moment. It was the beginning of an entirely new kind of captivity. Because when someone has lived under psychological domination for months, when every thought, every word, every movement has been dictated by another, freedom feels terrifying. In the days following her rescue, Elizabeth was physically safe, but mentally, she was still inside the cage Mitchell had built. He had taught her to distrust the world. He had rewired her instincts so that danger felt familiar and safety felt alien. His voice,
That twisted mixture of scripture, threat, and command echoed in her mind. She had been trained to look for him, to anticipate his wrath, to measure every action by how he might respond. This is what trauma specialists call post-captivity conditioning, when a victim's sense of self and reality remain tethered to their abuser long after the abuse ends. The chains become internal. The control continues as memory, as reflex, as fear. Mitchell had stolen her sense of agency. Barzee had enforced it with constant surveillance. Together, they had erased her voice, not just publicly, but internally. So when Elizabeth returned home, surrounded by love and safety, she didn't simply go back. She had to learn how to be Elizabeth again. The process of recovery, or what psychologists term deprogramming, mirrors the structure of captivity in reverse. First comes disbelief. For months, Elizabeth had been told that Mitchell was omnipotent, that escape was impossible, that her family would die if she disobeyed. Returning home forced her to confront the collapse of that entire belief system. It's not just relief, it's confusion. Her brain had to reconcile two conflicting realities. Mitchell said he was God's messenger, but he was arrested. He was powerless. Then comes reconnection. Survivors of coercive control often describe feeling like a ghost in their own lives. The rituals, names, and identities forced upon them still linger. Reconnecting with family, familiar smells, places, even her own name, Elizabeth Smart, became an act of psychological resurrection. And finally, there is reconstruction. This is the hardest stage. It means rebuilding a sense of self that isn't defined by fear. It means learning that freedom doesn't have to feel dangerous, that she could make choices again, even small ones, without punishment. This reconstruction can take years. For Elizabeth, it meant therapy, faith, and purpose. She didn't reject her religion, she reclaimed it. She took back the faith Mitchell had stolen and purified it of his corruption. She turned her story into advocacy, her silence into testimony. Through her foundation and her public speaking, she began to expose the psychological architecture of control that had once imprisoned her. That transformation, from victim to advocate, is not just symbolic, it's clinical. In trauma psychology, we call this meaning reconstruction, when a survivor takes the narrative their abuser wrote for them and rewrites it on their own terms. Elizabeth didn't just survive Mitchell, she dismantled the belief system he built. In the years that followed, she spoke openly about the mechanisms of fear and faith that had bound her, about how coercion can look like obedience, how silence can look like complicity, and how even the strongest spirit can be subdued by psychological chains. Her story forced the public to confront a difficult truth. Captivity is not always defined by locked doors or ropes. Sometimes it's belief itself that becomes the prison. And yet, Elizabeth Smart is living proof that belief, when reclaimed, can also be the key. When she stood before the court later and faced Brian David Mitchell, she didn't speak as Augustine. She spoke as Elizabeth Smart, the girl he tried to erase, the woman who refused to stay erased. She looked at him and said, "I know what you did was wrong. I know that you are not God's servant. You are a manipulator, a liar, and a predator." In that moment, the psychological cage that had held her for 9 months finally collapsed. Today, Elizabeth Smart's advocacy is not just about her survival. It's about understanding coercive control, recognizing that fear can be as powerful as a weapon, and that manipulation can wound as deeply as violence. She teaches that recovery is not a return to who you were before, but the creation of who you were meant to be once the control is gone. Elizabeth Smart's story is not just one of abduction and rescue. It's a case study in the resilience of the human mind, and a reminder that freedom is not just physical, it's psychological. And sometimes, the hardest part of escaping is learning to believe you're free. If this case moved you, share it. Someone out there is living inside a prison they can't see, and your awareness could be their key. Subscribe to Cold Case 48 for more psychological deep dives into the hidden mechanics of fear, control, and survival. Every watch, every share, every comment helps bring light to the darkest corners of captivity and gives power back to the ones who were never supposed to speak.